And you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
The Global Times reports Wang meets Kissinger as Kerry wraps up China visit. Beijing delivers clear message to Washington. When visiting U.S. climate envoy John Kerry wrapped up his 4-day visit to China yesterday, China's senior diplomat Wang Yi met with the centenarian former U.S. Secretary of State Kissinger, an old friend of the Chinese people, who has made historic contributions to the ice-breaking development in China-U.S. relations. During the meeting held in Beijing, Wang Yi called on the U.S. government to change its current China policy, which is now characterized as containment and suppression. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So the Chinese official, Wang Yi, also expressed hope that U.S.-China policy will have Kissinger-style wisdom and Nixon-style political courage, which was seen by experts as a clear message Beijing delivered to Washington, given that U.S.-China policy under the toxic environment of its domestic politics has deviated from a rational and sound track, creating growing obstacles for the bilateral relations. Dr. Horne, usually the Chinese are subtle, if not cryptic, in their public statements and readouts. Here, they are very direct and clear, but Blinken et al. Seem to be oblivious to the realities that are staring them right in the face. And I don't know how much longer China's going to keep saying, you know, now I done told you to stop messing with me, or you're going to make me slap the taste out your mouth. Dr. Gerald Horne.
Well, it's a real crisis. We should not underestimate it. It's a crisis reflecting the fact that when Mr. Kissinger worked his magic 50 years ago, there was a confluence of interests between Washington and Beijing, both focused on the mutual presumed antagonists in the then Soviet Union. But now the tables have turned. It makes no sense, quite frankly, for China to turn on Russia. That would only bring China closer to being the sole target of the lancing of U.S. imperialism. And the crisis is reflected also in the fact that U.S. imperialism has become heavily dependent upon China, not only in terms of the treasury bills, that is to say the People's Bank of China lending the U.S. government money up to the point of amounting to $1 trillion or more, although take seriously the idea that China might slowly and methodically be liquidating its U.S. paper. But it's also the fact that U.S. industrialists and financiers are heavily dependent upon the Chinese market. Witness the fact that Bill Gates of Microsoft was meeting with President Xi Jinping just a few weeks ago before Mr. Kissinger's visit. Tim Cook of Apple, Apple's ascension to being a multi-trillion-dollar corporation is inseparable from the fact that it has manufacturing facilities in a large market in China, although keep a close eye on Apple's attempt to diversify its manufacturing facilities into the new kid on the block, speaking of India. Elon Musk, the loose-tongued billionaire of Tesla fame, some of his major manufacturing facilities are in the People's Republic of China, and you note that despite his repetitive indiscretions, he has had little to say about China, despite the fact that he's had ample opportunity to do so. Jamie Dimon of J.P. Morgan Chase, one of the most influential banks in the United States of America, has also made his way into China, and not to mention Hong Kong. And the question really now is whether these industrialists will have to take a haircut. That is to say, will they have to sacrifice some of their financial interests in the pursuit of this new Cold War, and therein pay close attention to this bipartisan congressional committee focused not on China, but in their words, the Chinese Communist Party, which is basically been ringing alarm bells about the rise of China, because let's face it, the rise of China perhaps brings down the curtain on a half millennium of North Atlantic hegemony, first, at least with the United States succeeding London in that regard, post 1945, if not post 1880. And that is a very profound and significant event, which helps to underscore what this bipartisan committee is doing. Now in the crosshairs, believe it or not, is the University of California at Berkeley, which during the halcyon days of cooperation between China and the United States established all manner of cooperation between the two giants across the Pacific. But now this congressional committee is investigating UC Berkeley. And of course, we know that the Republicans on that committee, they see universities, professors, not to mention the San Francisco Bay Area, as mortal enemies. And so keep a close eye on that as well. So this is a crisis that will not go away easily, despite the ministrations of Mr. Kissinger, who is trying to save his signature policy of half a century ago, which brought China and the United States closer together and also might have prepared the way, interestingly enough, for the ascension to China as being the big kid on the block.
So whose interests are on the other side of the fight? You mentioned the industrialists. You mentioned Apple, Tesla, Microsoft. So they're there because of the industrial concerns. So who's Biden fronting for on the other side of the fight? In terms of U.S. in terms of U.S. foreign policy, who's the other side of the fight?
Well, as you know, there's a split in the U.S. ruling class. That is to say that you have financiers like George Soros, who is more than willing to launch a new Cold War against China. He has been a major funder of the Democratic Party and of liberalism and neoliberalism generally. And I think it's fair to say that those members of the U.S. ruling class who are heavily involved in finance are quite worried about the ascension of the People's Republic of China, quite worried about the growing role of the People's Bank of China, because they think it may lead to a clipping of their own wings.
Which brings us to the next article. The U.S. reckless arming of Taiwan as Washington follows the neocon Wolfowitz doctrine in East Asia. John Wall says U.S. provocations must stop. And that's, again, aligns perfectly with the first article, because while Kissinger is over there talking nicely, as you said, the Congress, et cetera, they're trying to still pump weapons into the, well, I would not say the border, actually into China. Your thoughts?
Well, just a footnote on the previous question, I should have mentioned the question of currency. Not only the prospect that the Chinese renminbi might replace the dollar, which obviously is of concern to George Soros and other financiers like him, but also BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, are obviously contemplating a BRICS currency, which would have the same impact as the replacement of the dollar by the renminbi. And so that also needs to be factored in. Now, with regard to your question, Garland, it's apparent that U.S. imperialism has a major crisis when it comes to Southeast Asia. It's not only the fact that it's difficult to separate the rise of China from the presence of a Chinese diaspora, which oftentimes is at the apex of society in Philippines, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Taiwan, etc. But also the fact that these countries have had their economies buoyed by the rise of China. They do not want to make a choice and join with U.S. imperialism in the new Cold War with China. They prefer to pursue these mutually beneficial and mutually profitable relations. And that is the dilemma that Washington now faces.
So now you have North Korea launching more missiles into the ocean, and you have U.S. Pentagon spokespeople talking about North Korea has developed an ICBM that can reach the West Coast. This does not seem to be changing the dynamic. The United States seems to be ratcheting up their rhetoric, not saying, okay, maybe we need to start cooling things down.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the question of North Korea, because also hanging fire is the presence in North Korea of a Black American soldier who was under military discipline by the U.S. authorities and defected. He crossed the border into North Korea. And this raises a question that has not been focused on for many decades, which is that during the U.S. war in Korea, 1950 to 1953, there were a number of Black Americans fed up with Jim Crow who crossed the border into the North. Their descendants oftentimes continue to reside in the North. I'm hoping that we'll get much more of a spotlight upon these descendants. But in any case, bringing up North Korea also brings up this lingering question of the United States also trying to twist the arms of its erstwhile allies in the Pacific to turn on the People's Republic of China, and reference here the fact that the overtures that Mr. Trump made to Pyongyang, to North Korea, were also tied to this idea that he could flip North Korea against the People's Republic of China, which I thought was not necessarily a bright idea, but he apparently thought so. In any case, look at New Zealand and Australia, who, like Indonesia and Malaysia, have had their economies receive a shot of adrenaline into the mainstream because of their relations with Beijing, and now being forced to turn against the People's Republic of China. This will not end well for those two Pacific nations, speaking of New Zealand and Australia. It will obviously end in tears.
But it also appears that there's heavy pushback, that there's some of the ASEAN nations are saying they're not an arena for proxy wars. You know, I imagine that they're looking over at what's happening in Ukraine, looking at what's happening at the vassals, and what appears to be a disastrous outcome in Ukraine on the horizon for the neocons, I would think is bound to have an effect on trying to create their next coalition for their next misadventure in the Pacific. Dr. Horne.
Well, that's probably the case. And in that regard, reference here is the latest news flash, which is that TSMC, the giant chip maker headquartered in Taiwan, which had been encouraged and enticed by Mr. Biden to build a like-minded facility in Arizona, now is backing down, saying that that will not occur this year nor next year, maybe by 2025. This may be indicative of the fact that the Taiwanese ruling elite, of which TMC is a major component, is also getting cold feet with regard to this idea that Taiwan is going to be a porcupine. That is to say that it will shoot its quills into Beijing, or that Taiwan will be the Asia-Pacific version of Ukraine. I don't think that's the fate that TSMC will want to enjoy.
I'm thinking the fact that the Biden people said if a war started, they're probably going to blow up TSMC. Probably might have had them scratch their heads a little.
And quickly, is this a data point for us to look at as we try to predict the outcome of the upcoming elections? Could the TSMC elite be saying, you know what? Our country is going to quickly be going in a different direction, and we're getting ready to ride the wrong horse?
I think that's a fair inference to draw, because obviously Washington does not care a whit, does not care a hoot about the fate of the Taiwanese people, just like it doesn't give a damn about the fate of the Ukrainian people. And let me mention also this recent news story about Mr. Putin not going to the BRICS meeting in August in South Africa. What's interesting about that is that President Ramaphosa of South Africa said that if they acceded to the wishes of the United States and arrested Mr. Putin, that would be a declaration of war against Russia. And Washington was probably nodding his head and saying, you're damn right. That is to say, they want to use South Africa the way they've used Ukraine, and South Africa is saying no.
And it's also interesting along that same line that in the articles that I read, they made it very clear that this was not a unitary decision, that this was a decision that was made by all of the BRICS members. It was a unanimous decision.
Well, certainly, because actually as early as June, that is to say weeks ago, Moscow and Pretoria had come to a mutually agreeable decision on that point. But Cyril Ramaphosa, the president, had to consult with other BRICS members, which he proceeded to do. And now the announcement has been made.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis. And we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.